My name is Evan Carter. I'm 63 years old, and for 35 of those years, I worked for the United States Forest Service. I started cutting fire breaks in the Plumas National Forest and ended my career as a district supervisor in the Sierra Nevada. I've spent more nights under the stars than most people have spent in their own beds. I know the sounds of the forest, the smell of pine on a dry wind, the weight of a pre-dawn silence. I've seen mountain lions, tracked bears, and stumbled upon hidden groves that felt like they hadn't seen a human footprint since the beginning of time. I say all this not to boast, but to establish a fact. I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I am grounded in the hard, tangible reality of the wilderness. What I saw, what happened up on Grizzly Ridge 4 years ago, was real. And it broke every rule of nature I had ever learned. It was supposed to be our annual trip. Me and Cal Jensen. We'd known each other since we were kids, and we'd been hunting and fishing these mountains together for the better part of 5 decades. It was a tradition, a ritual. A week in October, just before the first heavy snows, we'd pack up and head to an old service cabin we had permission to use. It wasn't much, just a single room with a wood stove and 4 bunks, but it was solid, and it was miles from any paved road. It was our sanctuary. This particular year, Cal had asked if he could bring along his cousin, Brian, and Brian's new girlfriend, Megan. I was hesitant. Our trip was about quiet, about the rhythm of the woods, but Cal was insistent. Brian was a good kid, he'd said, just a little loud. Needed some time away from the city. I agreed, of course. How could I not? Cal was my best friend. So we made our preparations. Brian showed up in a brand new, bright orange parka that probably cost more than my rifle. He had a case of craft beer and a portable speaker he seemed determined to use. He was all city energy, a bundle of nervous jokes and loud laughter that felt out of place before we'd even left the gravel road. Megan was quiet, polite. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She held a brand new digital camera and wore hiking boots that were still stiff from the box. I could tell she was here for Brian, not for the woods. Cal shot me an apologetic look as Brian started explaining the intricate flavor profiles of his IPA. I just nodded and forced a smile. It was only a week. The drive up to the cabin was the same as always. The paved highway gave way to a county road, which turned into a graded dirt track, and finally, a deeply rutted Forest Service path that was barely passable in my old Ford F-150. The farther we went, the more the modern world fell away. Cell service vanished. The air grew sharp and clean. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, the sun was casting long, golden shadows through the Jeffrey pines. The place was just as we'd left it, dusty, smelling of cold ash and old wood, but solid. Home. While Cal and I started the familiar process of opening the place up, unbolting the shutters, sweeping the floor, checking the wood pile, Brian immediately cracked open a beer and started trying to find a signal for his speaker. Megan hovered near him, looking uncertainly at the dense wall of trees that surrounded our small clearing. The first day was normal, almost painfully so. Brian's music was an irritating buzz against the backdrop of the wind in the pines, but we managed to get him to keep the volume down. Cal and I sighted in our rifles, splitting the afternoon with the sharp crack of .30-06 rounds. We chopped wood, hauled water from the spring, and by the time dusk settled, we had a roaring fire in the stove and the smell of frying bacon filling the small room. Brian told loud, rambling stories about his job in software sales. Megan took pictures of the sunset. Cal and I sat back, sipping whiskey, letting the familiar comfort of the place wash over us. It felt right. It felt safe. That feeling would not last. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. It was subtle. So subtle that at first, I dismissed it as my imagination. I woke before dawn, as I always do. I stepped outside into the cold, crisp air, my breath pluming in front of me, and I was met with silence. Not the usual morning quiet of the woods, which is never truly quiet. Usually there's the chatter of a squirrel, the distant call of a jay, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. This was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, absolute. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I stood there for a long time, scanning the tree line, a prickle of unease on the back of my neck. Nothing, not a sound, not a flicker of movement. I mentioned it to Cal when he came out to join me. He'd felt it too. He stood beside me, his gaze sweeping the same perimeter, his brow furrowed. "It's dead quiet," he murmured, his voice low. "Too quiet." We were both men of few words, but we understood each other perfectly. This was unnatural. Brian stumbled out a few minutes later, complaining about the cold and asking about coffee. He didn't notice the silence, of course, or if he did, he didn't understand its significance. He clattered around, his voice echoing in the still air, and the spell was broken. Or rather, masked. The wrongness was still there, underneath his noise. It was a bass note of dread I could feel in my bones. Later that morning, we decided to do a short scouting hike to the east, along the ridge that gave the area its name. We left Megan at the cabin. She said she wanted to read. Brian came along, his bright orange jacket a garish slash of color against the greens and browns of the forest. The silence persisted. We walked for nearly an hour and didn't see a single squirrel, not one chipmunk. We didn't flush a single bird. The woods were empty. It was as if every living creature had fled. Brian, oblivious, kept up a steady stream of chatter. Cal and I walked on either side of him, our rifles held in a low, ready position, our senses on high alert. The feeling of being watched was immense. It was a physical pressure, like the air thickening around us. That's when we found the deer. It was a large doe, or what was left of her. She was lying in a small clearing, and the scene was one of pure carnage. But it was wrong. I've seen dozens of predator kills in my life. A mountain lion will usually drag its prey to a secluded spot, cover it with brush. A bear will tear and rip, but it eats. There's a purpose to the violence. This was different. The doe had been torn in half, literally, ripped apart at the torso. Her entrails were strewn across the pine needles, but nothing had been consumed. One of her legs was broken at an impossible angle, the bone jutting out. Her head was twisted all the way around, her dead eyes staring back at her own hindquarters. There were no bite marks in the way a wolf or a lion would leave them. There were just massive, gouging claw marks and the evidence of shocking, brutal strength. Brian went pale and turned away, gagging. Cal knelt, his face a mask of grim disbelief. He ran a hand over a deep furrow in the doe's flank. "What the hell did this?" he breathed. I circled the carcass, my eyes scanning the ground. The tracks were a mess, the ground too disturbed. But I saw one partial print in a patch of damp earth near a tree. It was huge, vaguely canine, but too long, with a distinct heel pad that shouldn't have been there. And the stride, whatever had made it, was walking on two legs. The prints were in a line, not the staggered pattern of a four-legged animal. "Bear?" Brian said, his voice shaky. He was trying to convince himself. "Had to be a big one, a real monster." I shook my head. "No bear did this, Brian. A bear doesn't kill for sport, and it doesn't walk like a man." I pointed to the line of disturbed earth where the tracks led away. "This is something else." Cal stood up, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle.
He looked at me, and I saw the same cold fear in his eyes that I felt in my own gut. We had been coming to these woods for 50 years. We thought we knew them. We were wrong. We decided without another word to head back to the cabin. The scouting trip was over. The hunt was off. The only thing that mattered now was staying safe. The walk back was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig under our boots sounded like a footfall behind us. Brian had finally fallen silent, the gravity of what we'd seen sinking in. The woods no longer felt like a place of peace. They felt like a place of ambush.
The oppressive silence had returned, broken only by our own movements. When the cabin finally came into view, a collective sigh of relief went through us. Megan was on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking scared. "I heard something," she said, her voice trembling. "About an hour ago. A scream. It didn't sound like an animal." We didn't tell her about the deer. We just told her to get inside. We barred the door and shuttered the windows, plunging the cabin into a dim, dusty twilight. The fortress that had once been our sanctuary now felt like a trap. As the afternoon wore on, we tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. Cal kept the fire stoked. I cleaned our rifles for the third time. Brian drank his beer, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by a sullen fear. Megan sat on her bunk, staring at the wall. The conversation was strained, punctuated by long silences. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, we all flinched. The sun began to set, painting the narrow slits in the shutters with streaks of orange and purple. Darkness in the deep woods is a profound thing. It swallows the light whole. That night, it felt like it was swallowing everything else, too. The first sound came around 9 o'clock. It was a heavy, deliberate thump against the far wall of the cabin. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was solid, like someone had slammed a shoulder into the logs. We all froze. Brian, who was sitting at the small table, knocked over his beer bottle with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Nobody moved to pick it up. We just sat there, listening. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. "Probably just a log settling," Brian whispered, but his voice was thin and reedy. Cal shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the wall. He didn't believe it, and neither did I. Then came the scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape of something hard against the wooden shutters of the window next to my bunk. It was a rhythmic sound. Scrape, pause. Scrape, pause. Like a nail being dragged through wood. A very, very large nail. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I picked up my rifle from the bunk beside me, the weight of it a small comfort. Cal did the same. We looked at each other across the dim, firelit room. The question was in his eyes. What do we do? There was nothing we could do. We were inside. It was outside. And it was big. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. We were all straining to hear, to catch any hint of movement. And then we heard breathing. A low, wet, guttural sound right outside the door. It was the sound of a massive animal, a deep, resonant rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was sniffing at the crack beneath the door. Snuff. Snuff. The sound was so close, so intimate. It was inspecting us, assessing us. Megan let out a small, choked sob, and Brian clapped a hand over her mouth. The breathing stopped. A long, tense moment passed. Then The doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, the old brass knob jiggled back and forth. It wasn't a random rattling. It was being manipulated. Whatever was out there was testing the lock, trying to figure it out. I watched, mesmerized with horror, as the latch clicked and strained against the heavy iron bar we had dropped into the brackets on the inside of the doorframe. The bar held. The turning stopped. There was a low sound from outside, a frustrated growl that was deep in the chest, full of a terrifying, intelligent rage. It knew we were in here, and it wanted to get in. I crept to the nearest window, my rifle held tight against my shoulder. Cal moved to cover the door. Very slowly, I eased the corner of the wooden shutter open, just a crack, and peered out into the moonlit clearing. My blood ran cold. Standing not 20 feet from the cabin, partially obscured by the shadow of a large pine, was a figure. It was enormous. It stood on two long, powerfully built legs that were bent like a dog's, but it stood upright, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, a great slab of muscle that tapered down to a narrow waist. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in what looked like large, human-like hands with thick, dark claws. And its head was the stuff of nightmares. It was purely, unmistakably canine, a long muzzle, pointed ears, and a thick ruff of dark fur around its neck. It turned its head slightly, and in the pale moonlight, I saw the glint of its eyes. They were shining, not with the green or yellow reflection of a normal animal, but with a faint, malevolent red. It was real. It was standing right there, and it was looking right at me. I slammed the shutter closed and stumbled back, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. "What was it?" Cal hissed, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, my mind struggling to process what my eyes had just seen. A wolf's head on a man's body, the legs of a dog, the intelligence to test a doorknob. It was impossible. It was a violation of every natural law. "Evan!" Cal's voice was sharp, snapping me out of my shock. "What did you see?" I finally found my voice. "It's big," I stammered. "On 2 legs, like a man, but not. It has a dog's head, Cal. A wolf's head." Brian made a noise, a strangled gasp of disbelief and terror. Megan began to cry silently, her body shaking uncontrollably. The creature outside let out a howl. It was not the call of a wolf. It was deeper, more resonant, and it was filled with a chilling, guttural quality that was part animal and part something else entirely. It was a sound of pure, predatory dominance, and it echoed through the silent forest, a declaration that this was its territory, and we were the intruders. The sound hammered at the walls of the cabin, a physical force that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand up. It was answered by another howl, farther away, to the north. There were 2 of them. The siege began in earnest then. A heavy object, a rock the size of my head, slammed into the roof with a deafening crash, shaking the whole structure. Another followed, and another. It was trying to break through the roof. We huddled in the center of the room, away from the walls, listening to the relentless bombardment. Splinters of wood rained down from the ceiling. The noise was incredible, a chaotic symphony of splintering wood and deep, angry growls from outside. It was a calculated assault. It was trying to flush us out, to panic us into making a mistake. The rock throwing stopped as suddenly as it began. For a moment, we thought it might be over. Maybe it had given up. The hope was a fragile, stupid thing. A new sound started, a deep, rhythmic thudding against the main door. It was using its body as a battering ram. The heavy oak door groaned, the hinges straining. The iron bar we had in place was bowing in the middle with each impact. Thud, Thud, thud. Each blow was a punctuation mark in our terror. We were trapped. There was nowhere to run. The four of us were crammed into a small wooden box, and a monster from a fever dream was trying to smash its way in. Hours passed. The assault was relentless but patient. It would batter the door for a while, then stop. It would circle the cabin, its heavy footfalls crunching on the pine needles outside. We could hear it sniffing at the walls, scratching at the logs. It was testing every inch of our defense, looking for a weakness. Sometime after midnight, it started to use psychological tactics. We heard a voice, a faint, high-pitched cry. "Help me. Please, help me." It sounded like a woman, terrified and in pain. Megan's head snapped up. "There's someone out there," she whispered, her eyes wide. "We have to help her." "No," Cal said, his voice a low, hard command. "That's not a person." The voice came again, closer this time, just outside the window. "Please, it hurts. Let me in." It was a perfect mimicry of human distress, but there was something off about it, a subtle, resonant undertone, a predatory quality hidden beneath the feigned panic. The creature was smart. It was trying to use our own compassion against us. It was a level of cunning I had never encountered in any animal. This was not a beast. It was a hunter. The long night wore on. We took turns watching, our rifles never leaving our hands. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through us. The creatures, we could now hear both of them moving around outside, seemed to be content to wait, to wear us down. As the first hint of gray light began to filter through the cracks in the shutters, the activity outside seemed to lessen. The footfalls grew more distant. Maybe, just maybe, they were nocturnal. The thought was a sliver of hope in a sea of despair. By full daylight, the sounds had stopped completely. The woods had returned to an eerie, watchful silence. We waited for another hour, listening, before Cal finally decided we had to look outside. We had to know what we were dealing with. He unbarred the door, his rifle at his shoulder, and eased it open a few inches. I stood behind him, my own weapon ready. The clearing was empty. The sun was shining. For a heart-stopping moment, it almost felt like we had imagined the whole thing. But the evidence was all around us. Large, deep tracks crisscrossed the clearing. The door was splintered and dented from the assault. A pile of large rocks lay on the roof. And our truck, my old Ford, was a wreck. The hood was peeled back like a tin can. The engine block was smashed, wires and hoses torn out and scattered across the ground. All four tires had been slashed, not just punctured, but ripped open with incredible force. They had stranded us. They had systematically and intelligently removed our only means of escape. That was the moment my hope died. This wasn't a random encounter. We were being hunted. They had penned us in, and they were waiting for nightfall to return and finish the job. We had to make a decision. Stay and fortify the cabin, hoping to outlast them, or make a run for it. It was at least a 10-mile hike to the nearest paved road. 10 miles through their territory, with them potentially hunting us the entire way. Staying felt like a death sentence. The cabin was sturdy, but it wouldn't hold up to another night of that kind of assault. Leaving was a gamble, but it was our only chance. We had to go, now, while it was daylight. We gathered what we could, our rifles, our remaining ammunition, a small pack with water and a first aid kit. We had to travel light and fast. Megan was nearly catatonic, her face pale and slack with terror. Brian was jumpy, his eyes darting everywhere, his bravado completely shattered. He was a city kid, and he was in way over his head.
Cal and I were scared, but our years of experience gave us a focus. We knew the terrain. We knew we had to keep moving. "Stay close," I said, my voice low and firm. "No loud noises. We move fast, and we don't stop." We set out, moving in a tight formation. I took the lead, Cal took the rear, with Brian and Megan in the middle. The first hour was agonizingly slow. Every step felt like a thunderclap in the unnatural silence. The forest was still empty. No birds, no squirrels. Just the four of us, moving through a dead landscape. The feeling of being watched was constant, a weight on our shoulders.
We didn't see them, but we felt them. They were out there, in the trees, paralleling our path, waiting. It was Brian who made the first mistake. We had to cross a small, shallow creek. He slipped on a wet rock and went down with a loud splash and a yelp of pain. The sound echoed through the trees. We all froze. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, from the ridge to our left, came a low growl. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal. The hunt was on. "Go!" I yelled. "Go now!" We scrambled up the far bank of the creek and broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, all pretense of stealth gone. Panic had taken over. We ran blindly, desperately. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots seemed to grab at our ankles. Behind us, we could hear them. They weren't running. They were loping, moving with a terrifying, powerful gait that covered ground with frightening speed. The sound of their heavy footfalls was getting closer. Megan was sobbing as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Brian was right in front of me, his orange jacket a beacon of panic. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't looking where he was going. He tripped over a fallen log and went down hard. "Brian!" Megan screamed. Cal and I spun around, raising our rifles. Brian was on the ground, trying to scramble to his feet. And then it was there. It came out of the trees in a blur of dark fur and muscle. It was the one I had seen from the window. It stood over Brian, its massive form blocking out the light. It looked down at him, not with animalistic hunger, but with a cold, terrifying intelligence. Brian screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure terror. He tried to crawl away. The creature reached down with one of its long arms, its clawed hand closing around the back of Brian's orange parka. It lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I fired. The .30-06 roared, and the bullet struck the creature high in the shoulder. It staggered back a step, a snarl of pain and rage twisting its canine features. But it didn't drop Brian. I fired again, and Cal fired at the same time. Both shots hit it in the chest. It roared, a sound of pure fury that shook the trees. And then it turned and crashed back into the forest, dragging the screaming Brian with it. The sounds of his struggle, of tearing fabric and breaking bones, faded into the distance. And then there was only silence. Brian was gone. Just like that. Megan collapsed, her mind finally breaking under the weight of the horror. She just knelt on the ground, rocking back and forth, making a low, keening sound. There was no time to mourn, no time for shock. The other one was still out there. Cal grabbed Megan by the arm, hauling her to her feet. "We have to move," he said, his voice raw. "Now, Evan, now!" I nodded, my mind numb. We half-dragged, half-carried Megan, plunging deeper into the woods, away from the place where Brian had been taken. The rest of the day was a blur of terror and exhaustion. We didn't stop. We just kept moving, driven by pure adrenaline and the primal fear of what was behind us. We could hear it sometimes, a distant howl, a snapped branch just out of sight. It was hurting us,
toying with us. We were no longer the hunters. We were the prey, being run to ground. Megan was a dead weight, her eyes vacant. She was in shock, her body moving but her mind gone. Cal and I took turns supporting her, our own muscles screaming in protest. As dusk began to fall, we stumbled out of the trees and onto an old, overgrown logging road. It was our first sign of civilization, our first glimmer of hope. But we knew we couldn't stop. Night was coming, and with it, they would come too. We pushed on down the road, our pace a stumbling, exhausted shuffle. Every shadow seemed to hold a tall, canine form.
Every gust of wind sounded like a low growl. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I was running on empty, my body and mind screaming for rest. It was full dark when we saw the headlights, a pair of bright beams cutting through the blackness, coming toward us. For a second, I thought it was them, that their eyes were that bright. Then I heard the rumble of an engine, a truck, a real truck. I have never felt a wave of relief so powerful, it almost brought me to my knees. Cal and I started yelling, waving our arms frantically. The truck slowed and then stopped. An old man with a long white beard leaned out of the window, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "You folks all right?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't form words. I just pointed back into the dark woods we had just escaped. "Worse," was all Cal could manage to say. The logger's name was Silas. He took one look at us, at our torn clothes, our exhausted faces, at Megan's vacant stare, and told us to get in. He didn't ask too many questions on the long, bumpy ride back to town. I think he knew that whatever had happened, we weren't ready to talk about it. When we finally hit paved road and the first streetlights of a small town called Downeyville came into view, I started to cry. I hadn't cried since my mother died 30 years ago. I just sat in the back of that truck and wept from sheer, gut-wrenching relief. The aftermath was just a different kind of nightmare. We were taken to the local sheriff's department. We gave our statements. I told them everything, exactly as it happened. I told them about the silence, the deer, the siege on the cabin, the creature that stood on 2 legs and had the head of a wolf. I told them how it had taken Brian. I could see the look in the young deputy's eyes as I spoke. It was a mixture of pity and disbelief.
He thought I was crazy, that I was suffering from exposure and shock. Cal backed up my story, his voice flat and tired, but unwavering. Megan couldn't speak at all. She was hospitalized for severe shock and dehydration. They sent a search party up to Grizzly Ridge the next day. They found the cabin, just as we'd described it. They found my wrecked truck. They found bloodstains and a few scraps of a bright orange parka. They found Brian's body a few days later, half a mile from where he was taken. The official report said he was killed and partially consumed by a black bear. Case closed. A bear. They looked at the evidence. A cabin that looked like it had been hit with a wrecking ball. A truck engine that had been torn apart by impossible strength. A man who had been ripped to pieces. And they called it a bear. It was easier. It was a comfortable lie that fit into their understanding of the world.
My 35 years with the Forest Service, my reputation as a level-headed and experienced woodsman, meant nothing. I was just another old man who had panicked in the woods and made up a wild story to cover his friend's tragic death. I was dismissed. Only one person seemed to listen. The sheriff, an old man named Roberts, who was just a few years from retirement. After I'd given my official statement and been politely ignored, he asked me to stay behind. He poured 2 cups of thick black coffee and sat down across from me. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes tired and full of a deep sadness. I've been sheriff in this county for 40 years, Evan, he said, his voice low. I've heard stories, things that happen in the deep woods. People who go missing and are never found, or are found in pieces. Things that don't make sense. He took a slow sip of his coffee. You and your friend are lucky to be alive. My official report will say it was a bear, but you and I know better. My advice to you? Go home. Forget what you saw, and never, ever go back to Grizzly Ridge. There are some places man was not meant to be. He was the only one, the only official acknowledgement that what I had experienced was real. It was a small comfort, but it was also a confirmation of a terrifying truth. The authorities knew, or at least some of them suspected. They knew there were things out there that they couldn't explain and couldn't control, and so they covered it up. They chose the comfortable lie over the terrifying reality. It left me and Cal utterly alone with the truth. It's been 4 years since that night. I never went back to the mountains. I sold my rifles. I can't even stand to walk in a city park without feeling a prickle of fear, without scanning the tree line. The joy and peace I once found in the wilderness is gone, replaced by a permanent, gnawing dread. The world feels thinner now, the veil between what is known and what is unknown, terrifyingly fragile. I have nightmares every night. I see that canine face, those intelligent, hate-filled eyes. I hear Brian's last scream. Survivor's guilt is a cold companion. Why did I live when he died? Could I have done more? The questions haunt my waking hours. Cal and I are still friends, but things are different. We don't talk about what happened. We can't. The memory is a raw, open wound that will never heal. But there's a look that passes between us sometimes. A shared understanding of the horror that binds us together and separates us from everyone else. We are the only two people on Earth who know what really happened to Brian Jensen. Megan never fully recovered. Her family moved her to a long-term care facility. The official diagnosis is PTSD, but I know the truth. She saw the impossible, and it shattered her mind. My name is Evan Carter. I am a rational man, a man of the woods, a man who believed in the ordered, natural world. But that world is an illusion. There are things in the shadows, things in the deep, quiet places of the earth that are older and stronger than we are. They are intelligent, they are predatory, and they are real. I'm telling this story because the official reports are a lie. People need to know. The maps are not complete. Not all the monsters are in the storybooks. Some of them are out there, waiting, in the silence of the forest.
And if you are not careful, if you go too far from the light, you will meet them.